Welcome to the Mission Matters podcast, a podcast from Shield Capital where we explore the technical opportunities and challenges of developing and deploying commercial technology to national security customers. I'm Maggie Gray.
And I'm David Rothside.
And we are your hosts from the investment team at Shield Capital. All views expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of their employers or investment advice. References to any securities are for informational purposes only and do not constitute an investment recommendation or offer to provide investment advisory services. In this episode, we're joined by Brendan Karp, the CEO of Obviant, a government market intelligence platform. I had a lot of fun co-hosting and also a little bit interviewing this podcast with my colleague David Rothside, who led this deal at Shield Capital. David really could have actually used this product back when he was an Air Force acquisitions officer. So he was really the perfect person to have on here to talk about the exciting world of DoD contracting data and budget data and procurement processes, etc.
Well, Maggie, I gotta say, it was an absolute honor to finally come on to the esteemed Mission Matters podcast, especially, yes, to talk about a company like Obviant that may appear mundane to the casual observer. But for those of us steeped in this national security government procurement system, this is truly critical, especially if we're going to achieve efficiencies in government and better outcomes for taxpayers and for startups that are trying to sell compelling technology into the government apparatus. For those who don't know, but maybe you do because you're listening to this podcast, like the government procurement system, it's made up of thousands of different systems and information sources. Alarmingly, some of it still runs on paper and spreadsheets and is siloed off in hundreds of different databases. And, just for an example, the upcoming $1 trillion defense budget, it's going to be delivered in thousands of pages of PDFs. And, for Obviant, they're tackling this problem by building the data source of truth for programs, acquisition, organizations, and budget data for all of the Department of Defense. They've built an AI platform that creates a common data operating picture with incredible workflows on top of that data foundation. And I'm just really excited for that conversation we had with Brendan.
All right, David, Brendan, so great to have you guys both on the show today. We have Brendan Karp here from Obviant, the CEO of Obviant, and then David Rothside from the Shield Capital team is joining us today for this special episode on the world of DoD budgeting and contracting and acquisitions. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to just start laying the groundwork. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Obviant and how did you get into the world of government contracting in the first place? It's not exactly the sexiest topic that you can end up in.
No, definitely not. It's typically not how I describe it. I think it's a really niche but somewhat important thing, especially as you think about the budget and the acquisition side of it. So I'll give a little bit of background as to why I chose to focus on this problem space. And my upbringing. So I grew up in the DC area, in around the Beltway, but actually had no exposure to government whatsoever. Right? I grew up in a family with no government involvement, and the last company I was building, the last startup, most of that business was in the private sector funding early stage technology companies. However, we scaled a $20 million Homeland Security innovation program where we would take those same non-traditional companies and fund them around mission needs. And that was my first exposure to public sector problem sets. And I was hooked because for me, it was this amazing intersection of getting to build, but for a problem that actually mattered, right? Like the public sector mission sets we got to focus on for that program, first responders, Homeland Security use cases was incredible. And the flip side of that story, though, is that although it was a ton of fun working on those problems, it felt like punching a pillow at times trying to make progress. And I think anyone, and especially I know David will resonate with this, anyone that's been part of the government acquisition or innovation ecosystem feels that, right? So flash forward, we scale that program, great. The impact, honestly, was somewhat limited by that acquisition process. And I knew I wanted to build a company from zero again. And the thing that was missing for me in every other space that I explored, whether it was enterprise SaaS or otherwise, was that mission piece. Like that was really real for me of like, why am I going to wake up every morning and want to work on this problem set? And it was the impact. And so for me, it was kind of a no-brainer at that point to focus on the government space and take all those learnings and that experience that I had building that last company and do this specifically in defense and national security, because I truly felt that this is the highest order problem of our time to work on. And that's what drove me to start Obviant and work on this challenge.
And David, you led this investment at Shield Capital along with Mike Brown. What got you so excited about this space? You're obviously an expert in the acquisition space. What about Obviant really stood out to you?
Well, thank you, Maggie. I think expert is definitely in the eye of the beholder. But I have had the privilege of being in this defense acquisition system for quite a long time. And I will say, very rarely in my, I guess 15, 16 plus years of being around defense acquisition, rarely have I ever come across somebody who was like a complete independent party, didn't grow up in the system, wasn't an acquisition or a contracting officer, and really understood the subject material. And not just at like the high levels of, oh, the defense industry base, it's shrinking, oh, the defense industrial complex, it's challenging to work with, oh, I've, tried to work with it, won a contract or didn't win a contract, and it's terrible. Like, no, Brendan truly understood some of the insides and outsides. Like, I think the first time we met, we got very wonky on the what's called a DODAC, a DoD activity address code.
Yep.
And I would be hard pressed to find 5% of acquisition officers in the military who know what a DODAC is, right? So like some of this nuanced stuff that I knew that what Brendan was building would be very compelling. And I will say at first, when I started exploring this space of what are all the tools out there that can help a company understand the marketplace, right? The federal marketplace. At first it was, who can I partner with on behalf of Shield Capital for all of our portfolio companies and try to get them a discount? And when I met Brendan, it turned into, okay, how can I be a partner and collaborator with Brendan on a full-time basis, ideally through an investment, to help accelerate the opportunity that's in front of us to really build out the source of truth around government procurement data.
One thing I've got to call out is I think that is the one and only time that having knowledge of what a DODAC is has actually gotten me points, because it is a terrible party trick otherwise. So
yeah, I wouldn't bring it up too often otherwise.
not your typical first date question. So Brendan, can you tell us a little bit about, what is actually the state of tooling to track DoD contracts and budgets and acquisitions today, both within the US government and in the private sector? And how is Obviant really pushing forward the state of that tech? And, maybe David, I don't know if you have any horror stories here from your time in government, if you want to chime in with anything like that.
Yeah, I think just real quickly, and then I'll let David speak to some of those horror stories or whatever you want to call it. Truly appreciate all the belief and conviction that David and you and the team at Shield have had in us. But that was always our goal, right? Was like to that point where he was able to look and say, this person or this company gets it, right? It was always like, how do we build this for the people that know this system and have a deep level of empathy for them, of like are working it inside and out every day, and represent the data in the way that they wish they had it, right? And so to your point on what is the landscape of tools, that is a lot of the challenge, is that the way that folks like Dave and others who have been in those chairs, right, the tools they wish they had don't often exist. It's often PDFs or spreadsheets, phone calls to other people who have information that they don't, right? And then separated different enclaves and systems that don't talk to one another. So not only is there a base level access to the data problem, right? So we don't even have access to that, and that takes weeks, months to coordinate that. For much of the information, which is open source, by the way, the second level is then, even if we had access to it, the tooling that we're used to in the commercial sector, right? You think of like something like Airtable in terms of how you can manipulate simple data sets or build your own database. Analytical dashboards. None of that really exists in the form that we have in the commercial sector side in the government.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go back to my time at the Pentagon. We used a system called ABIDES, which stands for Automated Budget Interactive Data Enterprise System. It recently got replaced in 2022 with its with a new thing called Program and Budget Enterprise System, but Abides was built in the 1970s.
Wow.
It was DOS based, and you had to like hit F2, F7 to move through it. And this is how the budget was built, program element by program element, and then rolled up into some other system at OSD and then sent off to the Office of Management and Budgeting, OMB. And it was just sort of like you had defense contractors in the Pentagon solely for the purposes of being able to like maneuver with that type of a system. So, it's really not a surprise that the department doesn't necessarily understand everything that's going on when you're still constrained to systems in large parts that were built, in the 1970s on these mainframes that really should have gone away a long time ago.
Um, so Brendan, tell me, why does Obviant need to exist in the first place? And who are really the different kinds of users that you guys are targeting?
Yeah. So I'll go back to what I was talking about a little bit ago, right? Which is like, how does this process actually play out right now? So if we talk about the acquisition process, where's the funding? What budget is available? What are the different programs that funds? Who are the organizations and the people that actually own those programs? What does Congress think about that? And how are they changing that money, adding to it, subtracting from it, and then the companies capturing it? All these questions are surprisingly difficult to answer, right? And most people can't get the answers. Not that they don't know how to, but it takes a long, long time to do it. Just to answer one of those questions take you weeks of, if you're on the outside of the building, diving through 15 different PDF documents, 3 different websites, Googling searching on Google or looking through LinkedIn to kind of connect those dots. And all that information that exists out there in this weird mix of structured and unstructured format, right? So there is no actual source of truth to actually follow the money. And so that first archetype that I'm speaking to is on the private sector side. And when we started Obviant, that's who we thought we were solving for. But what we quickly realized is that same problem is equally as acute within the building, right? Like, to make critical decisions. And if you're in David's shoes, to actually execute acquisition or innovation programs, you don't have that data at your fingertips. And so what do? You have to do that same research process, dig into different systems, or make phone calls and try to get that data from other people, right? So what we do is we ingest all of that information. So we pull from thousands of different sources, like an open source intelligence company, right? And fuse that all together into an actual source of truth, right? We use AI, machine learning, to actually structure and connect that data up. And so who that benefits is that we've realized is, on the private sector side of things, we can help a company understand what is their execution roadmap, where is their capability relevant, and where can they solve problems, and where is their funding for it. From an investor standpoint too, where are the largest markets and where are the trends going? Where should we deploy capital? And then within the government, it's actually how to execute efficiently, manage their portfolios, collaborate, understand where there might be duplicate efforts and could be working together. And lastly, one of the biggest things is technology transition. So we're funding all these different capability areas, but where is their long-term sustainment funding and partners that we can work with? And so kind of tying all that together, right? If you listen to that all of those parties are asking similar questions from different angles. And it all kind of boils back to this fact that there is no common operating picture from a data standpoint for them to ask those questions and get an answer in a structured, organized way.
Yeah, that was masterfully said, Brendan, and couldn't agree with you more. The way that the DoD on the inside organizes is around different functional areas. And so if you were to say, what is the budget for this grouping of programs around this technology area, and who are the organizations that are executing, it would be a very manual process to put it together. In fact, it would come from some sort of a request from information on one of those terrible systems that, does taskers. And then, would kind of filter out to a bunch of people like me, like former O4s, O5s, that are, providing oversight for a myriad of different programs. And then we would reach out to the outstations, and say, hey, does this thing, do you think your program subscribes to it? And maybe I'll just give like a specific example. When I was still in the building, the undersecretary for research and engineering highlighted 14 critical technology areas, things like biotech and hypersonics and artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. And the way that the department kind of rolled up how much funding was going into these different technology areas was by asking all the different like program elements, how much of your budget is AI? How much of your budget is hypersonics? Of course, like the program I was on, we had $0 in hypersonics, but my program was the Advanced Battle Management System, right? Which was the Air Force's major investment into Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which was another amorphous topic. I sort of, I don't know. I don't know how much of my $5 billion budget over the future year defense plan is associated with artificial intelligence, but I gave a number. And so it's like these types of things that where what Brendan is doing is taking the actual data that is being executed against these contracts and lining it up to the organizational structure and the people that are executing them and the programs that Congress cares about. And I guess creating this taxonomy whereby you can understand what these similar but not necessarily functionally aligned elements are telling you. And at a high enough level, you can really derive some valuable insights. And so whether you are a program manager doing market research around a solicitation topic area, and you want to know who are all of the performers that have executed against these types of capabilities in the past, or you just want to get better insight into how much funding is going into these types of capabilities, based on actual data that is being executed against, whether it's in, I forget what, the federal procurement data of FPDS, right?
Yep.
You can start to get real meaningful understanding of what's happening in the department. And that can then greatly inform where you choose to apply your resources or how you do your evaluations. And then on the VC side, like totally agree. If we're seeing, how many counter UAS companies do we see, Maggie? Like,
So many.
and how much actual budget is going towards this area? Like, not that much. Or if they are, who are they going to? It tends to be the large defense primes. It becomes a bit of a challenge to make an investment here because one, the total addressable market isn't that big for who you would expect to be the largest buyer, national security. And it seems like it's got pretty well locked down with the defense primes. So, these are just ways that we can help inform our startups, or inform our investments and then help our startups think about how they can penetrate the defense industry, the defense procurement system.
I'm curious, Brendan, how does Obviant actually maintain its database for these insights? I'm thinking about the president's budget request just came out, and they're devoting a lot of resources to programs like Golden Dome. And I know this is a new term, but it's probably going to actually incorporate a lot of existing and future programs. It's like, how do you guys think about organizing that data for something like that?
Definitely. And that is one of the key questions we get all the time is one, how do we organize it? And B, how do we keep it up to date and make sure it's accurate? And so one thing that I think is really important. So obviously startup urgency is critical, right? And moving fast and with incredible speed. But I also felt that building this space, you have to build something that really works, right? Like vaporware in the government market does not work, right? And that there are real mission use cases that has to be dependent on. And so for us, we actually went heads down and did nothing but data engineering for a year to figure out how these data sources were structured, how we could accurately represent them, and build the pipelines and structuring mechanism to actually keep that up to date, right? So to your point, you've called out a few of the larger sources that we pull from, but there's also thousands of other sources that we have to ingest to populate that core data structure and the schema, right? That underlies everything that we do here at Obviant. So to your point on how do we keep it up to date, we're constantly going out there and collecting more information, right? But making sure that when we do structure it, that it is at parity and we can trace it back to a source of truth, that this exact piece of a PDF or this point in a video hearing, right? And then now, because we've done that, we can consistently add to it, right? So how do we keep it up to date? For existing sources, that just happens in the background. But now when we work with folks on the government side or within industry that say, hey, we also have all of our own data that we want to understand what that means against the information that you collect. We want to rationalize that out against the acquisition landscape. It's easy for us to bolt that onto that data structure, kind of in a secure environment for them to unlock their own insights from it. So the data engineering challenges is where we started, actually, before we launched a product, to make sure that we had that. And along the way, we've had to really solve some of these more complex natural language processing problems to take these amorphous concepts, right? And my favorite is contested logistics. What is contested logistics, right? It is the big buzzword. It is one of the top priorities right now. But knowing that contested logistics means these 10 things, which have these other 7 components which relate to one another in that taxonomy tree. Those are some of the hard things that we've had to do to not only A, ingest and structure the information, but then B, continuously translate against it to unlock what people are looking for.
Maybe, Maggie, if you don't mind, I'd love to ask Brendan a question, sort of a
Please.
follow-up. So, say the DoD came to you and they were willing to give you some of the inputs that would go into their systems of record. Because right now you're only seeing the stuff that's publicly available, which in a lot of cases can be very rich because these are contracts, right? And contracts, it's a double ledger. So there's real money going in and people are signing their names. So trust me, it's very real. But what about getting inside some of the messiness as the programs are being developed, or with in the services themselves, they're doing gives and takes, and then the budget rolls up to OSD and they're doing more gives and takes, and then it goes up to OMB and they're doing more give and takes. With that sort of insight, what do you think something like Obviant could do for the department?
Yeah. I mean, to that exact point, and that's where I get really excited, right? Is that really it's a data challenge, and then how do we actually build the workflows and the product outcomes that meet the day-to-day challenges that we face in the department, right? And so to your point, fusing government data, whether that is the programmatic side of things or solicitations, CSOs, to what we're talking about that they might issue, and understanding what is the full pathway with that. Some of the things that we can unlock that we get excited. One piece right now is just following the money, audit, right? We talk about audit a lot right now in terms of ensuring that the DoD finally passes an audit. That's one area. Can we trace the dollars all the way from budget through to contract execution and understand where that money went? Another big one that I think is super top of mind is that when we're talking about developing non-traditional capabilities, that oftentimes starts out in the R&D side of things, but what is the transition pathway for that, right? So you fund these non-traditional companies. It is fundamentally a equal parts collaboration. So how do you work within the building? But also, in order to collaborate effectively, you need access to the data to do that. So if you're able at the outset to understand, I'm funding this CSUAS company, right? And I'm within one of the R&D organizations, there's realistically one of 2, 3 transition pathways that's going to follow to PEO missiles in space, right? Or IWS on the Navy side of things. So really solving these data problems and getting access to some of the other information, which we're working on right now with the government, can unlock a broad range of use cases, everything from the financial management side of the house and just portfolio, but all the way through which I'm personally most passionate about is that capability development side. How do we make sure that we actually take these capabilities that exist in the private sector and make sure they don't just die on the vine, but they actually get into the hands of the end users and critically at scale?
So if I heard you correctly, go back to April 2023 when Jon Stewart interviewed then DepSecDef Cat Hicks on fraud, waste, and abuse and the inability of the DoD to pass an audit. you think with the power of Obviant, at its disposal, and granted it would take some time, but you think the DoD could maybe actually pass a financial audit?
What I would say to that is what gets me really, really excited is the opportunity to partner with folks like that, right? And hopefully reach that outcome together. So I think that, so much of this is back to, the product and capability and culture side of things, is that taking a great, phenomenal, high performing team, which we think we're building here at Obviant, and pairing that with folks on the inside that feel the exact same way from the mission side of it and reaching that outcome, I think anything is possible. I really, really, really do.
So, all audits aside, Brendan, maybe you can highlight how your current customers are leveraging you today and extracting a lot of value. And if there's any anecdotes that you want to share, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's like that is the most rewarding part, is like when you're able to be part of building a product and you actually see it make a difference, right? Like it's producing the outcomes that you hope it would for a user. And so I'll talk about a similar thing across all three sides of our customer base. And on the company side, right, we had a fast growing defense technology startup, right? Think Series B onward, that has a capability, and they weren't quite sure how they could actually make that hop over to the program of record side and into the program office, right? And as we know, that's a multi-year battle. It takes a lot of different pieces that you have to connect and stakeholders. And so what we were able to help them understand is that for their capability, where do they actually mesh, right? And in this particular instance, that they fit in a couple of intelligence-oriented program offices across the DoD. And in particular, they were able to understand that this one program office had some very early RDT&E funding. And that RDT&E funding was actually being allocated for an emerging program, right? And it hadn't turned into a program of record yet. And so really early on in its life cycle, were they not only able to understand, A, where their capability maps, but B, understand something that is capturable, C, all of the atmospherics around it and the current players in that program office, where the strategic thinking was going there and how they're speaking about this, and then even down to the exact stakeholder to engage with. And what we found is that actually put them in the running to get a contract with that organization, right? And so that exact thread of basically taking something from capability all the way down to execution, right, is playing out with investors and funds that we work with, where they say, we want to make an investment in offensive cyber, right? What is all the money out there? And then who does that drill down to from an execution standpoint? And can we get to conviction there, right? And even on the government side, if you're developing that capability from the other side of the coin, right, you possess that early stage funding, and I'm the one that's prototyping these intelligence capabilities. How do I take that all the way through to actually identifying my transition partner, right? Who is the organization that can actually fund this through sustainment? Being able to power those kinds of workflows are the success stories that have just been unreal to be part of.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, I've definitely used the tool a few times to sort of really understand how much success a given company has had in a given area, and then been able to then also see other organizations that they're not working with and be able to point them in that direction. And it's only with a few, you know, semantic queries, pretty simple. I guess what would you say to companies that are interested in using something like Obviant, but maybe a little bit reluctant from the spend standpoint? And maybe you could also highlight, like, what's the earliest stage company, what's the latest stage company currently using your platform today?
Yeah. Yeah. So we've worked across that entire spectrum, right? From early stage companies that have just gotten their first CIBRA awards and are already thinking strategically about, well, what is my transition plan? What is my transition pathway? And what can I capture along the way to get there, right? And then all the way up to the top 10 primes, right, that we work with. So what we found is, for us, it's always been, and I said this at the outset, how do we take the workflow and the knowledge that the experts like you, David, have in this space, right? People that know this market like the back of their hand, and how do we democratize that and just make it dead simple and easily understandable and a beautiful product that folks can leverage and make it intuitive. So working across that spectrum, right? Obviously, budget and spend tolerance is vastly different. And one of the things that's always been really important to us is making sure that we build a business model that can accommodate all sides of that spectrum. However, what I will say is at the end of the day, you're making a long-term investment. And one of the things that we hear oftentimes that companies in the defense market have to do is engage on the Hill and engage early. And oftentimes that entails hiring a lobbyist, and that is not cheap. But the thing you oftentimes hear is if you don't do that, though, your upside is inherently going to be capped, right? And where you need to get to without that congressional engagement is going to be super hard. And we think that program office problem, right, and the funding, identifying that and running a strategic business development process is the same way. That if you're not investing in it early and continuously and running that effort in parallel with the immediate things, whether it's SIBRs or OTAs or otherwise, at the end of the day, you're going to have to be playing catch up over the long run. And it's a critical competency that you have to build early on.
So I want to take some time to really talk through some of the big changes that have been happening in the acquisitions and contracting space over the last 5 or 6 months or so. Yeah, right here we have two of the experts. I know I'm going to keep saying this word expert in DoD acquisitions and contracting. So I want to take the time to really break down some of these big changes. So, Brendan, can you talk through what are you seeing as some of the most important or impactful initiatives coming from the administration thus far? And can you break down, what do they actually mean for both, I guess, traditional defense primes for the DoD and for this new generation of startups?
Yeah. So I like to think about it in a couple of different realms, right? So one is really the how we buy side of things, right? And the how we buy has to do with more of the regulations and the processes around that. The other side of things I think it's important to touch on, which is the what we buy, right? And that's this discussion that we're having right now is shift from these large platforms to commercially available items, products, and what we actually need for the future from a national security standpoint. And the two are deeply related, right? So that first part of things is how we buy, right? And you saw this with the executive order around rewriting the FAR, right? Something that has been around for decades and decades and decades, which I'm sure David can tell us lots of frustration stories
And
about.
can you define the FAR? What does that mean?
I will defer to David on the actual definition on that. So, David.
Sure. It stands for the Federal Acquisition Regulation. It is about 3,000 pages around all the things you can and cannot do when acquiring goods and services for the government. So it extends beyond just the Department of Defense. It's for all federal agencies in the executive branch. And then, of course, beyond just the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the DoD has the DFARS, which is another set of TOOMs, further refining things that are more bespoke and specific to the DoD. Not to be outdone, the services tend to have their own, variations and variants on this document. And then, of course, you get down to the individual programs and they have their cultures, their guides, their instructions. Lo and behold, it's easy to see why the culture of compliance sort of permeates across the entire acquisition workforce.
And I assume, David, you've read the full FAR cover to cover.
I have not read the entire thing, but I am pretty good at most of the various parts of it, right? It's broken up into all these different parts. And so at times I have dug in and really tried to hone in where, I can find exceptions for things.
And that's one of the reasons. So the last thing he just said there, and why I think I wanted to defer to him to define that, right? Like exceptions for things, right? In order to be able to navigate that effectively and actually drive change, you have to know within this thousands and thousands of pages framework, know what part of it you can actually use to get done what you want to get done, right? And find the exceptions within it. So back to kind of your original question, Maggie, is one is this rewrite of the FAR, and then two, one of the other big things is promoting things like the software acquisition pathway, right, or commercial solutions openings, right, which David and the team at DIU years back pioneered and actually started, right. So this idea of we can leverage these other authorities different than the FAR, right? Other transaction authorities, et cetera, to actually accelerate the acquisition landscape. This is a huge shift in terms of the way that acquisition is done. And the big area that's being pointed at, back to that other category here of what we buy, the big area that's being pointed at, commercial solutions openings, again, is commercial technologies, things that can be adapted towards mission needs, or non-traditional startups that we can bring into the fold on prototyping agreements that are these more lower cost or adapted solutions that actually meet the capabilities that we need today, not 3 years out or 40 years ago from a major platform standpoint.
So, Brendan, you mentioned the commercial solutions offering a couple times now, but I want to take a step back from some of the acquisitions, contracting jargon. What does it actually mean to buy commercial, and why is that even important in the first place?
What this is essentially saying is that if there's a commercial alternative, right, and technology exists in the commercial sector that we can either leverage or adapt, right, we should be doing that, which makes sense. I think like one of my favorite, unfortunately, anecdotes is like a number of folks that I've talked to who are still active duty. They talk about how difficult the payroll process is, right? Like how awful the experience around payroll is, of like missed paychecks or having to go back and request pay that's been missed, or time off. And that, what does that tie back to? That oftentimes ties back to these massively complex custom built systems, right? Where the private sector, again, has built some of the best in breed, right? You think about companies like ADP, and on the startup side of things, what we know is like a Rippling or a Gusto, right? The private sector has been building these systems. And so this whole shift is to say, well, can we leverage things like that, right? And if not off the shelf, adapt it, right? Again, from a prototyping standpoint, to meet the mission needs, right? So when a commercial alternative exists, can we leverage that? Because what I think it's a shift to say is that there are certain things, absolutely, from a basic research or a custom, needs standpoint, that should not, cannot, and will not ever exist solely in the commercial sector. But there's a whole lot of things that the government does, right, and the government needs, excuse me, that exist in the commercial sector right now, that the incentive is out there for the commercial sector to develop, that is the best in breed, that leverages, top engineering talent across the board, and capital incentives from investors that the government can benefit from, right, and get that at not only a lower cost than it would be to build these systems over time, but a far superior capability, because the private sector is going to maintain that and upgrade it.
Maybe my favorite anecdote that Brendan, you were just highlighting around payroll, which yes, is an absolute nightmare. And I've had to call on the phone more than a few times to figure out my mill pay back in the day, especially when you move from organization to organization. Well, the defense travel system, DTS, is probably the bane of a lot of military and civil servants' existence. That was designed and developed by Northrop Grumman. I don't know if you knew that they were, known for their travel website ferocity. I mean, I thought they were more about building weapon systems, but yeah, Northrop Grumman won the contract to build defense travel system in 1998. So this is pre-dot-com bubble now, and they've gone on to win task orders, and it still remains to be the same system that is quite cumbersome. So much so that if I'm still in the reserves at the Pentagon, and if the reserve said, David, you can no longer drill locally to where you are, because I live in Washington, D.C., you now need to go to, I don't know, say Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So now for my reserve duty, I'd have to engage with something like DTS to get over there. I would definitely, at year 18, almost to 20, I would say, sorry, it's not worth it, because that system is just so brutal to work with.
And I think it's back to your question, Maggie, right? On the experience on this, and what does this buy commercial mean? All of this ties together, because what we're talking about is how do we bring these non-traditional commercial companies into the fold, right? Or accelerated pathways. Well, are those how do we actually get them on contract then? If they have to go through a multi-year contracting process, or the acquisitions officer doesn't actually have the tools in their toolbox to work with them quickly on prototyping for that solution. So these things really all kind of converge. And back to a lot of what we focus on is, well, how do we identify those capabilities? How do we identify the acquisition pathways? Well, what funding is available, right? So on the government side, how do I actually tap funding to leverage this? Like, where is there money in either my budget or elsewhere that I can partner with to do this? And it's equally as challenging on the private sector side. Not only is it a pathways problem, but it's also a demand signal problem, right? So from the private sector, how do they know that this is a problem worth solving, right, and worth focusing on? Meaning that if I have an expense management platform or a travel systems platform, how do I understand what millions or billions of dollars there is for me to capture in the DoD to go after that and adapt my solution and justify that to my investors, right? There is no source of truth for that is one of the hardest parts. So I think like all of these things, again, really tie together is everything from the approaches to if we're aligned on the approaches and we fix a lot of the authorities and regulations around that, conveying that demand signal is equally as important so that people can execute on both sides of the equation.
So, how can we actually, measure the effectiveness of the administration's new initiatives around streamlining defense acquisition? How do we know if rewriting the FAR or pushing the commercial solutions offering software acquisitions pathways actually makes a tangible difference in the state of acquisition efficiency?
And that's one of the challenges that we're hitting head on, right? Which is there isn't an easy way to understand when we leverage the software acquisition pathway or we leverage CSOs, what does that actually translate into down the road, right? So let's just pick an example here. Let's say a lot of the CSUAS efforts that we hear about, right? So
What's CSUAS stand for?
That's it. Counter small unmanned aerial systems. So think a lot of the things that we hear about in terms of small commercially available drones that folks are using that we have to defend against. Currently, a lot of the times we're using missile systems that cost upwards of $1 million, $2 million a pop to take those out, right? And so how do we bring into the fold more affordable alternatives to that again might be commercially available, but there is no way to track that. Great, we leverage the CSO right now. What did that translate into a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, right? What percentage of the overall capability that was fielded can we attribute back to that original OTA? Or if an OTA started off in prototyping, right, which means more that R&D stage, did that OTA transition to production? Was it fielded at scale? And one of the core problems, and this is what we're hitting head on, is that data is not either A, structured that way or structured to begin with, because again, it might only be in a PDF or a contracting document. And B, there's no traceability between those handoffs, right? So the R&D organization that might issue that prototyping agreement, there is no data source of truth between that and the production organization, whether it's a program executive office or otherwise, that fields it. So to your question on, well, what is the effectiveness of these things? That's a lot of what the department is trying to figure out on its own end right now is, well, what is the pull-through and the follow-through of when we use these new methodologies? What is the overall success rate in terms of companies that are transitioning to programs of record? And it starts with the data, right? And because the data is not set up to answer those questions and then we're not manipulating it, we're not able to get a clear picture of that.
Brendan, where are we today in terms of using some of these more innovative contracting mechanisms like OTAs and CSOs? And where do you expect us to be within the next few years?
I'll start with the end state, and I think exponentially different, right? I think that we are at the beginning of really, you look at kind of things like the CSO, and you can go back from there, consortia as the first models of leveraging this, right? At some level of scale. But we've really only scratched the surface. If you look at OT, other transaction awards, in the last year or so, in both years, it's less than 5% of all awards issued by the government in terms of dollars, right? Less than 5% of money is going to these innovative mechanisms. So if we look at all the discussion and the talk about defense tech and leveraging the software acquisition pathway and CSOs and OTs, it is still such a very, very small piece of how we actually contract today. However, with the momentum that we're seeing and the discussion around it and the actual policies that we're putting in place, I think that looks exponentially different if we look 3 to 5 years down the road. In terms of how not only the percentage at which that we leverage these authorities, but also the outcome that it can drive. If you look at the number of venture-backed companies, non-traditionals that have transitioned to a program of record, and I think that this is correlated, there's less than a dozen, right, that have actually gotten program office contracts. Like, we are still so much in the top of the first inning in this transformation.
What will it actually require within the DoD to take these top-down directives and actually make them a reality and a part of the culture across the organization?
I think it requires a lot of training. And then I think it also does require more publicizing of the anecdotes that are going well. Other transaction has been in the department as an authority since the mid 90s. One of the biggest programs to sort of leverage it was called Future Combat Systems, FCS. And it was like this massive multi-billion-dollar program that the Army was going to sort of digitally revolutionize all of their capabilities. So it was a hardware, software, data, like, I mean, it was kind of this crazy program, and it failed spectacularly. Now, if you go back, Rick Dunn, who's the greatest historian of other transaction authority, because he did bring it to DARPA in 1989 and then helped shepherd it into the DoD after that, he will tell you that program was only an OT in name. But if you look at the terms and conditions of the contract, if you look at the milestones and how it was executed, and Boeing, I believe, was the primary contractor, it was only OT in name. It really had nothing. It did not leverage the value proposition of that authority. And so, these things they ebb and they flow based on how successful or not successful things are. I think we need to just sort of mandate it as we are seemingly doing, but then really take to the craft and teach and celebrate the successes and showcase what does good look like. And I think that's kind of how you move the department over time.
Brendan, what would you say is your most controversial hot take about DoD acquisitions, budgeting, contracting?
Yeah, to be honest, not really a hot take guy. Prefer to just focus on the execution side of it. But I'll probably kick this question to him because I'm sure he might have one.
In spirit of Maggie, your question, one thing that has me a little bit concerned, and I haven't heard a lot of people talking about it, is with the people taking the return to the office and then being offered the fork in the road. A lot of great contracting officers, acquisition professionals have taken it. And I am concerned that the most innovative ones who should be awarding the contracts in this new, like, mandated way, leveraging, underutilized contracting vehicles like other transactions, et cetera. I'm afraid that we're going to have a bit of a glut in awarding contracts and getting non-traditional companies into the industry base. So a little bit of, cutting our nose to spite our face with what we're trying to do in the department. I think it'll get worked out, but maybe something, Brendan, if you wouldn't mind highlighting, like, is there a way to sort of see a trend analysis around some of these policies being enacted and whether or not they're having the necessary effect, or the velocity of contracts being awarded? Is that maybe going to shrink or not meet the same pace as previous years?
Yeah. And I think that's what you're speaking to there is tracking what the downstream effect and the outcome is, right? And this is one of the things that we find that in order to do that, so the platform that we've built, right, allows decisions to be made more effectively at every level, right? And so whether that's downstream from the end user or technology transition, right, if you're a program manager, all the way up to the headquarters level to understand, well, whether it's at the services or DoD, right, what are the implications of the changes that we make? And so to that same anecdote that I like to speak to is that OTAs are currently much less than 5% of all award values, right, annually. The same thing we can look at the data here to understand, when we make a policy decision or an HR decision over here, what is the impact in terms of contract velocity, right? And we can look at that information, understand, has that dipped? Has that gone up? Did we see an impact on these more innovative mechanisms that we wanted to use? And I think what I would say is that all ties back to the thing that we're so focused on is, how do we not only make this data accessible, but then do analytics, right, and manipulate it in a way that gives us the answers that are timely and critical to the actual decisions that need to be made that are gonna transform how we do business at the Pentagon.
What advice do you have for other startups building in the national security space, other than buy Obviant, which is obviously a given?
No, I appreciate that. You know, and then I'd love to hear David's take from the other side of the investor angle and government side. You know, I think the biggest thing is like be strategic and play the long game, right? With what you're doing, know that you're in most markets, right? Signing up to build a company is a 5 to 10 year journey, right? And in this case, it is that and then some, meaning that you might not see the payoff until 3 to 4 years into that journey, right? In terms of exponential returns. And so the biggest thing I would say is really like, you know, focus on something that you're truly passionate about and that you know, you feel that you have a connection to from the mission side of it. And know that you're playing the long game, both in terms of not only building the company, but also in terms of how you think about how you're building that product and executing the sales motion. That everything that you need to do in this space, I think, needs to optimize for what that long run is.
Well, that's awesome, Brendan. I guess, yeah, for me, advice for other startups, have a co-founder and choose them very carefully because it is a really hard, long journey, building something from scratch, trying to convince customers to try you out, trying to convince investors to collaborate with you, and then trying to hire employees, right, to go on that journey. And I think a lot of times companies where the co-founders just aren't totally in lockstep, it can be really, really challenging for the future success of the startup.
Brendan, David, thank you guys so much for coming on the show.
Really appreciate
Thanks,
it,
Maggie.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Thanks so much for having us.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Mission Matters podcast from Shield Capital. Tune in again next month for another conversation with founders building for a mission that matters. And if you yourself are looking to build in the national security space, please reach out to us.